Have you ever had your kid read something and completely miss the point? Like, not because they weren't able to read the words, they probably read every single one, but they kind of had like no frame of reference for what they were even talking about. It almost feels like they're reading the words on a conveyor belt that are just kind of moving past their eyes. Um, there are times when this happens, and there is a technique that can help your kiddo kind of connect with the material better and allow them to absorb new information. That's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to Continuing Education, a podcast for homeschooling families with actually useful information. I'm Heidi, and today we're talking about prior knowledge activation. If you're new here, this is the kind of episode where we take one research-backed teaching strategy and walk through what it is, why it works, and how you can apply it in your homeschool across subjects like math, reading, science, history, and life skills. So, prior knowledge activation, let's just name it plainly. Sometimes it's called priming. It basically means that you introduce new material before you open the book, before you start the lesson, before you explain anything, before you actually introduce that new material. You take a few minutes to bring up what your child already knows about the topic. And in that way, you're kind of pulling it from long-term memory and putting it front and center where the brain can actually use it in their working memory. Now, you might hear prior knowledge and think that sounds like something for a classroom with 30 kids and a whiteboard. It's not. It's for you. It's for your dining room table. It's for the car on the way to co-op. And here's a simple way to picture it. So imagine your child's brain is like a big city with a filing system, and every piece of knowledge they've ever encountered is filed somewhere. Sometimes neatly, sometimes it's in a junk drawer, sometimes it's stuffed underneath something else. When they encounter something new, the brain goes looking for the right drawer to put it in. If they can find a nearby folder, if there's a connection, the new information gets filed correctly and remembered and then easily retrieved later. So if there's no folder, that information just kind of floats and usually disappears. Prior knowledge activation is how you help your child find the right drawer before the new information even arrives. The strategy goes back to a psychologist named David Ausubel, who in 1968 proposed something called subsumption theory. The short version is basically that meaningful learning happens when new material gets incorporated into existing mental structures. That doesn't mean that they're kind of memorizing in isolation. They're integrating it and connecting it with what they already know. It's kind of just hooking on to what they already know. He said that the single most important factor in learning is what the learner already knows. Not the curriculum, not the teaching method, not any other, fancy thing that you put in front of them, but basically what they already know. Along those lines, the practical implication for you is really significant. It means that how your child learns something new is heavily shaped by what they bring to the lesson from the beginning. And that's really good news because you can influence that. You can intentionally activate the right mental folders before you teach. And that's the whole game. And as homeschoolers, we're perfectly primed for this because in a traditional school setting, in a public school or something, when a teacher is trying to activate that prior knowledge, they're not necessarily able to think of something very specific for each child, but you know your child better than anyone else. You can activate that prior knowledge through deeply personal, meaningful, and creative applications. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't require any special materials. It can be something that takes low effort, like a conversation, a question, a drawing, or a 2-minute brain dump. We'll talk more about the techniques momentarily. But it does require that you do it intentionally, and that allows you to build a bridge between what your child already knows and what you're about to give them. The bridge can change everything about whether or not the learning that you're embarking upon will actually stick. Before we actually get into the different techniques and strategies that allow you to implement this in your day, let's talk a little bit about the research. So the science is actually really interesting. The first place I want to point you is a large literature review published in the Review of Educational Research in 2024. There were various researchers that analyzed decades of prior knowledge research, and this one really got me. They traced this all the way back to a principle first articulated in 1984, that reading comprehension fundamentally involves, and I'm quoting them here, the interaction of new information with old knowledge, which I thought was really insightful because it wasn't just absorbing new information, It's actually an interaction. I loved the wording of the interaction. It's this back and forth conversation between what's on the page and what's already inside your learner's head. And that's a different picture than most of us have about how learning works. We kind of just think we're just kind of shoving information in, but really it's an interaction. It's a conversation between what they already know and what they're being given. The same review confirmed what Ausubel, the psychologist I mentioned from the 60s, the study said one's existing knowledge serves as the foundation of all future learning by guiding how new information gets organized, associated, and ultimately remembered. And so you might be thinking, well, what if my kid doesn't have a lot of background knowledge on a topic? And that's a totally fair question, and we have a couple of strategies that can help with that. The research addresses it honestly. Not all students arrive with the same prior knowledge, which means not all students are going to respond to the same strategy the same way. The benefit, of course, being a homeschooler is that you can be really creative and you know that prior. So if your child genuinely has no prior experience or exposure to a topic, you may need to build a little background before you can activate it. And we'll talk about that when we get to the practical section in terms of like the actual strategies and technique ideas. The part that shifted with me, though, is there was another literature review. This was in 2023, and it came out of Edutopia. If you don't follow Edutopia, it's geared towards traditional schoolers, teachers, but it's got a wealth of great information, and I love to get their email because it gives me lots of good ideas and activities for my own kiddos. Anyway, they analyzed 30 different prior knowledge activation strategies and found that tactics like concept maps, which are visual and labeled diagrams, low stakes quizzes, which are just like short, quick, frequent quizzes, and structured conversation, which is kind of a conversation that you're scaffolding on top of prior information. We talked about scaffolding in a prior episode. Those three things can meaningfully improve both comprehension and engagement. And they found that this was across subjects and ages, which was really interesting. And it wasn't just that kids felt more interested, it actually helped them better comprehend, and then their grades were reflective of that. There's also a little neuroscience in here. A 2023 study published in Scientific Reports looked at how prior knowledge actually changes brain activation during memory retrieval. And the researchers found that when a learner has had strong prior knowledge on a topic, their brains showed greater connectivity between the regions responsible for memory integration and recall, which means that the brain is literally working differently and more efficiently when prior knowledge is in play. I'm not an expert in education. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a mom trying to find methods and strategies that work for my kids, and I'm eager to share those with you guys. The simple version of this really is that a brain that's been primed with related knowledge processes that new information with less effort and holds on to it longer, which is really powerful. And that doesn't mean that the curriculum that you've selected doesn't matter, because it does. But it means that the most powerful thing already in the room is your kid, their prior experiences, their mental schema, the way their brain functions, and you can unlock it with some simple strategies. So let's get into how to put it into practice. Let's be specific. I love this part the most because a lot of times I listen to or I read books where they talk about something in theory, but they don't give me any ways or techniques to put it into practice. So we're going to talk about several of them. The first one is called One Good Question. So before you start a lesson or a chapter, a unit, a documentary that you're going to watch together, ask one question that taps what your child already knows or has experienced. And it's not a test question. It's not like, tell me everything you know about the American Revolution. Something just grounded to their everyday. So for example, for history, you could say, have you ever seen people argue about something so strongly that it ended a friendship? Let's talk about that. And then take a minute or two to talk about it. It's also very, I can't think of the right word, but like it's low risk for them to answer. There's no right or wrong. Maybe for science, you could ask, when you've been to the lake in summer and the lake in winter, what did you notice was different? And for literature, maybe you could ask, kind of give a one sentence, maybe something like, this story is about a kid who keeps a huge secret. Have you ever had to keep a secret that felt really heavy? Just kind of tapping into the emotional concept of that to help them connect it to themselves as you're about to dive into it. And it's just one question. That's it. You totally let them talk. You don't need to rush to the lesson. What you're doing, even in just that short moment of time, is just pulling the relevant mental folders forward, opening them up and making them available for what comes next so that when you start to dive into the lesson, they can properly file it and then retrieve it later. The key is that the question should connect to the emotional concept or the experience of what you're about to teach, not just the facts or the dates, the feeling, really, the situation, or the way that they can kind of parallel what they're about to learn to something that they already know. The second technique is called brain dump. This one is especially good for kids who've already been exposed to a topic before. So maybe you've covered ancient Egypt. You did ancient history, you covered ancient Egypt 2 years ago, and now you're going to circle back. And, so they have some prior knowledge about that. Or maybe you've done a unit on fractions and then you did some other work, but now you're about to introduce decimals. You just say, hey, take 3 minutes, write down everything you can remember about this topic, and don't worry about whether it's right or wrong. Just get it out. Just write it down. And if you have younger kids who don't write yet, or you have kids who don't want to write, you have reluctant writers, they can draw instead of write, or they can write on the whiteboard or something that makes it fun. That's equally valid. What this does is it's pulling information out of that long-term storage. So it's something that you've covered previously before. You're pulling that long-term memory forward and you're getting it into the working memory part of the brain. And that's where active thinking is actually going to happen. The brain literally has to go retrieve it. And that retrieval act is a form of learning. So already you're strengthening the memory pathways before new information even arrives. And then after the brain dump, look at it together. And you'll find that they remembered some things correctly, that they have some gaps. Maybe they had some misconceptions. All of that is useful. All of that is fine. The misconceptions, especially because if you teach new information over a misconception that's never surfaced, it gets filed wrong. And so it can create confusion later. So it's good for you to catch it now so that you can address it in the lesson. The third technique is called the anticipation guide. This one takes a few minutes to set up, but I think it's worth it if it's something that you want to put the effort into. This one, you write a short list of statements, 5 to 8, really not that many, related to what you're about to teach. Some are true and some are false. And then your kiddos read each one and mark whether they agree or disagree with the statement that you wrote, and then briefly why. The power here is that your kiddo has to take a position. They have to activate what they believe to be true based on prior knowledge and experience. And then when the lesson corrects them or confirms them, that moment of recognition is far more powerful than just reading a cold fact. It also helps your child learn to critically think and be willing and able to change their mind when presented with new information. At the end of the unit, you can revisit the guide, let them see where they were right, where they were wrong, and how their thinking changed. And that reflection is kind of a form of consolidating the information together. And that works across every subject: science, history, literature, even math concepts where kids carry misconceptions from earlier learning. It's a great opportunity to connect those dots together. The example that I'm thinking about this concept, particularly in relationship to math, is we introduced, I was talking about this with my husband previously about how there's like a gap in how we talked about math. We introduced fractions and then we did some other things. And then we introduced division, or maybe it was back and forth. I'm having a hard time remembering. I remember. We introduced fractions, then we did some other work, division, multiplication, all that. And then we got into algebra or pre-algebra, where they're also using fractions, but they're also dividing by fractions. And I realized that my kiddo never recognized that a fraction was just a form of division. And so this would have been a great time to pull that prior knowledge about fractions before we even get into pre-algebra, where we're starting to divide by things. This would be a great time to activate that prior knowledge to help connect the dots to material that they previously learned and make it more solidified and understand the inner workings behind it. All right, fourth technique, called the concept map. I really like this one because my kids are visual learners. This one's a little bit more structured, but it really works well for visual thinkers and for kiddos who like to see how ideas connect. Basically, you put the main topic in the center of a blank page, and then have your child kind of branch out from it. So every related word, idea, person, event, feeling that they can think of, you don't have to care about the order, just kind of a web of associations. Then at the end of your lesson or the end of your unit, you can add it to the map, show them what connects now that didn't connect before, and let them see their own thinking grow and change, and see if maybe there are other things that are connections between the different connections, right? It kind of starts with this one circle and all the prongs go out, but are there connections between the prongs that have gone out? For a child who struggles with writing, this is an especially low barrier entry point because it's visual, it's tactile, it doesn't have to feel like a test. It's just kind of like brain dumping, but in a visual way. All right, fifth and last technique. This one applies especially when your child has limited background on a topic. This is called building before activating. So the truth is, as we mentioned before, you can't activate what isn't there. If you're starting a unit on ancient Mesopotamia and your child genuinely has never encountered that world before or any concept related to it, a brain dump is going to be pretty sparse. And that doesn't have to be a failure. It just means that you need to lay a little foundation first. So if you truly can't think of any way that your kid can connect to this material, you can kind of lay that foundation. Watch a short video, maybe 5 minutes, look at photos together, read a short picture book, tell them a story about the place, just something short. And then after that initial exposure, you can activate it. So they're not necessarily pulling from long-term memory. It's something you just covered. You could say something like, hey, we just watched that clip. What stood out to you? What surprised you? What are you already thinking about? Is there anything you're excited to learn more about? And that just kind of allows the seed to be planted before you dive in. And when you dive in, now you're watering the seed. You're helping it to grow. Don't skip the activation step just because the prior knowledge didn't exist naturally. Build a little, then activate, then water. It still works. So when I first started thinking and reading about this strategy, I thought, I kind of already do this. I ask my kids question before we start things. I'm pretty good at connecting new material to what they know now, or what they knew previously. And I do. I do think those things are true for me, but I would say sometimes. What I realized is that I wasn't doing this consistently. It was more like when I remembered, or when the lesson felt big enough, or when I got excited enough, or when I had time. But what the research says is that it should be the first step every time, and not just for big units, not just for hard subjects, every lesson, every new chapter, because then you're kind of building upon each other. And when I started being a little bit more intentional about this just in the last few weeks, I think that it's made a difference. Even if it's just one question, even if it's quick, my kids can ask better questions and they get engaged a little bit differently than they used to. One example of this is we've been reading the book Animal Farm together. We like to pick different books and then read them together and then talk about them. And so we've been reading a couple chapters at a time. And when I activate, but prior to talking about it, I may activate it by asking a question, or I may not even necessarily activate something prior. I may just ask a question for them to think about while they're reading it, allowing them to kind of activate from the prior chapters that we read. They remember more and they're engaged more. So I'm not perfect at this. I can tell you lots of mistakes that I've made. I used to turn this into like a quiz. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that I make, is that like I would quiz them on things. What do you know about this? And then I almost would immediately correct them for everything that was wrong, or, oh no, it wasn't in that time frame. It was in this time frame. And that can totally backfire because it makes my kids less willing to answer. They're not going to take the risk to answer with what they thought they knew. The activation phase is really supposed to be about opening and not correcting. So you want them to surface everything, including the wrong stuff, in a way that feels less scary, low stakes for them. And then you can save that correction for when the lesson can do the work naturally. You don't have to correct them. That's totally okay. In fact, the fact that they're able to bring it up and you kind of gloss, you're not correcting them in the moment, allows them to self-correct later when the lesson introduces that information. The other honest thing I want to say about this is if your child is resistant or checked out, sometimes a prior knowledge hook can sometimes be the thing that turns kind of a flat, boring lesson or something that they're not engaged in into something that's engaging. it can give them a way in, a little foot in the door. And for kids who struggle with new information, that can really matter because it helps them build a little bit of confidence before they embark upon the knowledge. You're not just warming up the lesson, you're kind of welcoming their whole brain to the table. So let's close up this podcast. Thank you for being here. Prior knowledge activation, it's not a fancy strategy. It's probably something that you're already doing. It's not curriculum, though it is built into some curriculums. It's just kind of a habit that, something that I've been working on to get into just a few minutes at the start of every lesson, where I kind of help my kiddos find that mental folder. And whether it's, a brain dump or a quick analogy, that can be enough to change your child's brain in terms of the way they're thinking when the new material comes. You'll find links to the research we talked about. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper or see what else the research says in the show notes, I really appreciate you being here. If this was useful, please share it with someone who's in the trenches with you, another homeschool parent who could use a little research in the corner. I'm Heidi. I'll see you next time.